Welcome to the CANIE Climate Dialogues, the podcast at the intersection of international education and climate action. I'm CJ Tremblay, and today's good. I mean, our content is great, but it's also so good to be back after a long hiatus. And today's also exciting because we've got a new CANIE co-host for you today to talk about travel in our sector and some exciting initiatives with CANIE, the EAIE, and the Forum on Education Abroad, just to name drop a couple, to reduce our emissions without reducing the impact of our work and our experiences. And also, since we're back finally, you'll want to make sure, dear listeners, to subscribe to our podcast feed wherever it is that you lend your ears to the CANIE Climate Dialogues. And if you're one of our friends who listens on Apple Podcasts, let us know how you like the pod with a friendly rating, preferably all the stars, but you're the boss of you. So do what feels right in the spirit of climate action. So be sure to subscribe and rate. Those are two immediate climate actions you can take right now while listening to this podcast to continue your climate action and climate justice journey, because we are super committed to making sure we provide you with great interviews and discussions to help you take action within your organization. So people are always asking us what are easy things they can do. There's also hard things you can do, but those are two really easy things to get you started. So you can do that while you are listening to what we are about to get into. So let's get into it. It's really good to be back, and I can hardly believe it. And what's more exciting is our little podcast team has grown. And I'm excited for you all to meet more members of our podcast production team as we roll out new episodes. There will be a few new voices on the CANIE Climate Dialogue podcast, and that is awesome. So today we are starting with one of our podcast producers, Kelly Davis. She's here with me today. Kelly, hi, welcome.
Hi, CJ. Thank you.
How's it going?
It's going well. It is a rainy day in Oslo, Norway, where I am based. Pretty classic for fall weather in Oslo, for sure.
Oh, that tracks. Very fall weather for Vancouver in Canada also. Very cool. Awesome. So this is one of my favorite parts of the podcast, is introducing and bringing along new people. So for our listeners to get to know you as I've gotten to know you in these last few months, can you tell everybody sort of what brought you to the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast? How did you become an active volunteer with CANIE?
Sure. So I used to work at a really small college in California, and I was a study abroad advisor and a career services advisor. I also did a little bit of international student advising towards the end of my time at Menlo College is the name of the institution I was at. And it was during the pandemic, in the beginning, when CANIE had its first summit, and I attended because I am quite passionate about climate change, and I think we'll get into that in just a little bit. But I wanted to learn more. I thought this was such a great initiative, and I wanted to be involved somehow. It wasn't until about a year later, so I always kept CANIE on my mind, but about a year later, I left Menlo and I moved to Norway to pursue a master's in higher education. And I thought that was the perfect time to get involved. So I joined the Europe chapter, which was great. And it was in the springtime that I really started getting involved. So I joined the Travel with CANIE initiative, which is what we're going to be talking about later today, thanks to Margarita Pasquini. So she really took me in, and I am very appreciative of that.
Also, you expressed interest early on about being part of the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast when we kicked off sort of the idea of starting over again and sort of kicking off our new season, which is great because you're like well suited to that with a very, very calming and steady voice. So
Thank you.
Great for all of our listeners' ears. That's awesome. So are you like a big podcast listener, fan? Do you have some faves?
Yeah, what really got me hooked actually to podcasts, because I don't think for me, I'm a natural kind of listening learner. I think I'm much more do and visual. But so it had to be something really really special to get me into listening to podcasts. And it was actually the Inside Study Abroad podcast in 2019 that got me hooked. So it was something that really assisted my learning. I was the only one working in study abroad in my office and like at the institution I was at. And I needed supplemental learning materials because I was new to it. And that just kicked me off into listening to tons of podcasts about higher education. Well, when I say tons, I think I spent tons of hours. There are many out there, many more out there now, but it was actually for me, I felt like there wasn't enough. Well, I did start listening to CANIE Climate Dialogues as soon as the podcast released. I was definitely really interested in that and wanted to add it to my kind of repertoire of listening to podcasts. I'm really interested actually in podcasts as a learning medium, also as kind of a research sharing medium. But I just remembered one other podcast that I have to name is the Fresh Ed podcast. That's a fantastic podcast that tries to really talk about education, research and education, and make it kind of comprehensible. So you don't have to read the whole article. And Will Brehm is the host of that, and his mission is really to kind of see how that can be used as a research, a means of kind of conveying research, and I think that's really fantastic.
So a quick study to the podcast game, and dear listeners, I will tell you that Kelly came to our first podcast production meeting with loads of ideas for how to make this even better, because it can be so much better with the big team. It's just super exciting stuff. One of the things we've done with all of our CANIE co-hosts is really trying to understand and share with our listeners your climate story. So what is your climate story in a nutshell? How did you come to be in international education, and how and when did you connect it to climate action?
Actually, I don't always think about this, but when I was studying abroad in Berlin, Germany, I went to a New York University small campus in Berlin. And one of the things I did my second semester there was start an initiative that was, I think, I'm afraid I'm like conflating parts of my own history, but I think I called it the Earth Impact Club. And we tried to kind of do initiatives, like figure out like how can we actually, incentivize these Americans who would come to actually recycle the way that you're supposed to in Germany, because they didn't all the time. It was very easy, but plastic bottles, as an example, would end up with the trash. So we tried to incentivize that, and so that was one of the things we did. Or we would go out to community gardens or something like that, try to do small field trips to kind of observe how in Germany they were handling things differently, maybe from a more environmental standpoint, than we had experienced wherever we were from, which was mostly the United States, but sometimes other places. So there was that element. And then I had been involved in other initiatives on my campus in New York. And when I returned, I became more involved in the NYU campaign to divest from fossil fuels. So I was a student activist. Cool. My fun party fact that people love to remind me of is that I occupied an elevator. I was not always in the elevator. The elevators were too small to have all of us, even though they were quite large elevators. But I assisted in the organization of all of that and did stay overnight. Just a little fun fact. And
I freaking love that. That's so awesome. Both on like, this is a podcast typically for practitioners, and so much of what we do is make sure that we're trying to listen to students as much as possible, so that you were this like super activist student who's now joining the ranks of the practitioners. Love that energy for this podcast, for the sector. I think that's really, really exciting, and makes you so well suited to being one of the co-hosts of the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast. So great. And any little other tidbit before we get into today's content?
I think just that, I think that those two things of traveling, which can, be a lot of fossil fuel energy in the air, carbon emissions, but then also loving to travel and having developed those deep personal connections with people across the world. It's something that I think that is so, the planet is so special, and being able to engage with people on this planet is so special. And so I want to encourage people to be able to travel, especially students, but anyone willing to engage in learning, even if it's outside of an institutional educational setting. And I think that we need to figure out ways to make that possible. So that's why I'm here.
Love it. Well, there you have it, everybody. Kelly Davis, who's going to be a prominent and important voice as part of this podcast relaunch, are involved in a big way about what to wrap this up and say thank you for being a part of this. It's so exciting. And for our listeners, you're really in for a treat with Kelly and the crew of people that we've got working behind this. Kelly, thank you. And I will hand the rest of this episode over to you.
Hi, everyone. I am your host today, Kelly Davis, here to talk about an initiative I've been involved with since the spring called Travel with CANIE. This initiative was born out of the Europe chapter and seeks to inspire professionals in the international education sector to travel sustainably for work travel, starting with traveling by train, bus, or boat to the EAIE and Forum on Education Abroad conferences held in Europe this fall. This is the first episode of a multi-part series on practitioners' travel. In this first episode, we'll hear from Noreen Lucy about the impact of international education travel on carbon emissions, and from Margarita Pasquini about the goals of the initiative. Margarita is another CANIE member who has taken charge of Travel with CANIE since its beginning. These conversations were held over the summer before anyone participated in Travel with CANIE this last September and October, and provide context for why we should choose to travel with CANIE. This episode sets up future episodes, which will feature people who actually traveled by train to the EAIE conference in Barcelona, and who will share their experiences. First up on this episode, I speak with Noreen Lucy, who runs her own consultancy company working with universities globally, creating international partnerships and developing international strategies. Her passion is delivering sustainable priorities and objectives for the universities she works with. She also works in the arts and culture sector as a sustainability coordinator with a festival and live events company, and works in creating policy within the arts and culture sector in Ireland. She holds sustainability qualifications from University College Cork and TU Dublin. When she can, she volunteers with CANIE Europe to join a group of dedicated fellow professionals from international education in changing behaviors in how we work and travel.
Noreen, if we can start by you just telling us a little bit about how you got involved with CANIE and why this work is so important to you, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, this work is very important to me. I suppose in the past few years, I've been very concerned with climate change and biodiversity loss and what is happening to our planet. And working in international education, there's obviously a concern in terms of the amount of travel that we're required to do. And also the very essence of our job is putting people on planes. And I suppose I've always had that concern. I've always had this conflict in terms of my work and also in terms of my passion for climate action and trying to live and work more sustainably. And it was at EAIE in Helsinki when I met the wonderful founding members of CANIE. And it really was like finding my tribe. You know, these were people in international education who had similar concerns, who were grappling with trying to find solutions in how we could work more sustainably, how we could continue doing the wonderful work we are doing in international education, but looking at that in more of a sustainable lens. So I suppose it really was that perfect fit, you know, in terms of finding people who were doing the work and were seeking the same answers as I was. And I've loved being involved. I'm working with the CANIE Europe chapter, and that is a very, very dedicated group of people in terms of volunteering their time to really trying to make a change. And I am constantly inspired by the people in CANIE, the work they're doing. And it's also very supportive, in terms of, I suppose, trying to overcome this kind of sense of, I suppose, feeling sometimes overwhelmed in relation to how big the problem is. So yes, that's a very long answer to your question. But yeah, I think it's been a wonderful few years working with the really inspirational people at CANIE.
A long answer, but an accurate
Yeah.
answer, of course. But and I think that you're right. I think a lot of what we are all concerned about is just the amount of contribution international education has towards these growing problems. And that's why you're with us today to talk specifically about more of a little bit about the numbers, but just kind of understanding what that impact looks like when it comes from international education. So I don't know if there is an exact estimate. Maybe I'm putting my foot in my mouth because I have read lots of papers on this, but the exact numbers or estimate around just how much CO2 emissions are emitted into the atmosphere, how much international education contributes. But is there an estimate out there?
Yes, Kelly, and I think that the key word there is estimate. There's a lot of work currently being done on calculating the amount of CO2 emissions and the contribution that international education is making. I'd say it's an emerging research area, and I know that we've probably read the same papers that are out there, but there certainly is excellent work being done, and it's definitely a growing area. I suppose what we see a lot of now is, I suppose, a lot of tools that are becoming available to universities and institutions. And I think this is, I suppose, a very interesting area in terms of universities calculating their overall emissions and then seeing where does international education fit in that. So that individual, I suppose, research and impact piece. And then for universities and institutions being able to put targets on reducing their emissions, but then in calculating the carbon budgets for international office staff and faculty travel. But I suppose to go back to your question, I suppose in terms of the contribution globally from international education to carbon emissions, there are several estimates, but it's anything up to 30 megatons of CO2 per annum. And I suppose looking at what that equates to in terms of how we can visualize that, it would be comparable to the carbon emissions of a country such as Bulgaria or Slovakia. But again, there's a lot of work being done in, I suppose, updating those numbers, but we are very much drawing on the excellent research that has been done and is continuing in this area, which has been led by Dr. Robin Shields at the University of Bristol. And I think, he's very familiar to CANIE and a very good friend of CANIE, and his work has been invaluable in terms of us understanding the impact. And I suppose just having that base work to build on. So what's good is that there's a lot of people working on this and updating this, but I think the more that universities and institutions are doing their own research on this, the more we can build on the knowledge that we have. But I suppose what's important to note as well is that, estimates are that, and this is the important piece, is that the emissions from international student mobility in higher education is increasing. And of course, we had that significant drop during the pandemic, but it is increasing. And I suppose this correlates understandably with the increase in the emissions from flights. Like it's currently around 2% of global emissions, but it's increasing dramatically. The number of aircraft being manufactured and needed, it really is that it's only going in one way in terms of the number of flights and consequently flight emissions globally.
I didn't know that about the overall sort of plane emission contribution. I guess that makes sense. More people are able to get on planes, and so that's going to grow. But I do want to call back briefly to another episode in the podcast. It's episode 9 for our listeners, where Robin Shields was on the podcast discussing his research. So that certainly goes into the depth more on the research side of knowing what you have so wonderfully summarized here. and I think also provided a different perspective on. But when we're thinking about how the universities calculate their own emissions, it kind of under the aspect of how much is the university itself contributing, do they typically look, you mentioned students and faculty, are international education offices generally also considering their own travel as professionals? That's kind of why we're having this episode, is to talk about practitioners traveling to conferences or site visits, etc.
Yeah, typically a university would consider that travel. I suppose it would all fall within their scope 3 emissions in terms of the faculty and the international office staff, like their travel to and from work, but their travel, I suppose, internationally and attending conferences, that would all be factored in and calculated as part of their scope 3 emissions. So yeah, very much so. And any of the universities that I suppose I'm familiar with who are calculating their emissions are setting their carbon budgets and including the international office and the faculty, and in relation to their travel.
Great, good. So thinking about how we're all flying, there are alternative methods. If you say are an Erasmus student and you're staying on the continent in Europe, depending on how the proximity of your hometown to where you're going to be staying for a semester or two, it might be feasible to take the train or a bus, even if it is a bit of a longer journey. But so thinking not just about Europe, but other countries, there are still barriers to using those alternative methods of transportation, be it train or bus. And I'm wondering if you can tell us about some of those barriers.
Yeah, there's huge barriers. And I think even we recognize those barriers just in terms of our behavior. I think flights have become so much cheaper. So it is, I suppose it has just become part of the norm in Europe that we hop on, a Ryanair flight, and it's cheap, it gets us there faster. And of course, some of the main barriers are that cost in terms of getting there cheaper, but also the time it takes. Sometimes train travel in Europe can be 3 times more expensive than rail, or it can take 4 times longer to go by train than air. And I suppose that has created that behavior as well, so we've become so accustomed to cheap flights in Europe that we simply don't consider other options. Flights are cheap, we arrive at our destination quickly, and we're just used to getting there cheaply and quickly. Slow travel has become a thing of the past. It really has been replaced by those low-cost airlines. Also, and I suppose we could sit here and discuss the reasons why that is all day, but jet fuel is subsidized by many governments. Rail companies are often privatized in countries and they need to run on a profit. Some countries have inferior rail infrastructure to other countries, which makes it difficult to travel within Europe. It's also quite challenging to organize your travel, looking at different modes of travel. And we've seen this in terms of our discussions around getting to EAIE by train, by ferry, by car. It's a complex piece to organize. But I would say that the main reason certainly is behavior, that we've moved from slow travel to very fast travel. It's the cost, it's the time, and it's just easier to fly many times.
That's a good point. It's just that we're not used to budgeting an amount of time. We don't think about our trips maybe as, I don't know, as intentionally almost, in the sense of thinking about how rather so many students, I did this, I'm guilty as charged, but I certainly went places, for a weekend. And so not thinking necessarily about, okay, well, is there a way that I can use, a week-long spring break to maybe do something that is a little bit more local? Maybe I'm not flying from Berlin to, I didn't do this, but Berlin to Athens, but maybe going to Prague and up to Krakow or something along those lines. And so because we want to see other places, that we want to go far, we don't, it's more difficult to budget time as well because of the pace at which we go in society.
That's true. I think as well, I've always, very careful to point out that we shouldn't penalize young people either. I think it's very important that we don't wave the finger at young people and students and say, well, you can't travel, just because we had the opportunity to travel and see the world and experience cultures, that is so necessary. And I've always been very careful in terms of identifying the professional travel and the business travel and the frequent flyer travel. And it's that, I suppose, social justice piece as well. We really can't stop young people from traveling because we have to give them the opportunity to travel. So I think we have to be careful as well in terms of how we manage this with students as well, because they certainly have that right to see the world. But what was really interesting recently, I heard a number that it's just 1% of the global population that are responsible for about 50% of flights. And it's very unequal when you think that about 80% of the global population has never flown commercially. And I know there's data out there in terms of the contribution of private jets to flight emissions as well. So there's just that social justice piece there as well that is that just makes the whole climate conversation so complex, but important to understand as well, that we don't take these opportunities from the people who deserve them as well.
Excellent point. Yes. So this is kind of a great segue into this. What are differences between individual action and systemic change then when we're thinking about our carbon emissions and how much our office is putting out or how much the university is or ourselves? And then once we've discussed that a little bit, does a project like Travel with CANIE fall into either of these categories or even both?
Yes. Individual action, I think we can feel, I know that there is individual action is difficult, isn't it? We all feel that we're going to great measures to do the best we can and to, I suppose, limit our own actions that are contributing towards emissions and climate change. And it can feel very, very difficult, but for me, I think individual action is what drives systemic change, when you have enough people joining that movement. And I think there's a percentage of how many people you need to join a movement for it to change a system. And I think it's just 25% is all we need of the population to make that change. So I think it starts with individual action. And I suppose the Travel with CANIE initiative, it supports individual action. It's providing support, resources to people who want to travel by train and reducing their emissions. So that's very important because it's enabling individual action that will hopefully drive the systemic change that we need. So I suppose it's not just about encouraging people to reduce their emissions, it's about education, creating awareness, and hoping that you build that momentum and you start small, but you get to that number where you have enough people who are now considering how we work, how we travel, how we attend conferences, and how we're making these changes to reduce emissions. So I think the Travel with CANIE initiative is so important because the potential for this to make people stop and think about how they're working, how they're traveling, and how important it is to change the mindset. And I suppose it's just that behavior piece. It's disruptive, it's saying, oh, I could hop on a flight and go direct to Barcelona, or I could pay an extra €100. It could take me 10 hours longer, but I'm really, really thinking about how I work and how I'm doing things. And I think that's what we need. We just need that disruption. We need that change in mindset. Yes, they're individual actions, but we're hoping that it's going to grow into a movement.
Absolutely.
Pardon the pun.
No, yes. The system is made up of individual particles, so it has to move together and can't move without the others.
No.
Noreen, thank you so much for taking the time to share some of the research and some of your thoughts on these questions. It's been great having you today to speak with us.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
And now a quick word from our sponsors today. The University of Auckland's International Office is proud to sponsor the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast series. New Zealand is a unique place to think about climate through the lens of our Indigenous cultures, leading the world's universities in the Times Higher Global Impact Rankings as we work towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The international team at the University of Auckland share your concerns about climate action and international education. The University of Auckland, answering the world's call. Want to get more involved with CANIE? Check out our Climate Action Week. This year, Climate Action Week will begin on November 28th and last until December 2nd, 2022. It's a week-long series of sessions that cover climate action and international education. Head to the show notes to check out the website where you can register for these sessions. Now that we have heard about the impact of international education on emissions, it's time to talk about how we can address this as practitioners in the field. Margherita Pasquini, Italian, has worked for 13 years in higher education and currently holds 2 jobs, one at the Università Cattolica, where she is in charge of partner relations and program promotion, and the second at FPP, a global tech recruitment company, where she is the regional manager for Europe for high school events. She has been volunteering with CANIE for 2 years and will explain more about herself in just a moment.
So Margherita, before we start talking about the Travel with CANIE project, this is your first time on the podcast, and I'd really love to give you the opportunity to tell everyone why you've joined up with CANIE, why you've been working with the organization, and why this cause is so close to your heart.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, sure. I'm happy to share a bit about myself. So I hope it makes more sense what I'll be saying next and why I'm so passionate about this project and about CANIE. So my name is Margherita Pasquini. My primary job, I have 2 jobs. My primary job is study abroad coordinator at Università Cattolica, where I'm in charge of partner relations and program promotion. And I also have a second job at FPP, the global tech recruitment company, where I'm the regional manager for Europe events, for high school events. So what the 2 jobs have in common is traveling. So traveling has always been a huge part of my life. Since I was like a student, I studied abroad many times in different countries, Australia, UK, France, Spain, Switzerland. I volunteered in Brazil twice. And so when I actually got the job at Cattolica 13 years ago, I felt it was just, the perfect fit. It was a job that was designed to make me happy because it would kind of allow me to do what I would do anyway, but also being paid for that. So that was traveling, meeting new people, exploring new places. And so that was what people and friends would envy me for. And I feel like kind of this story is not just my story. It's the story of most educational professionals in the field. For what I've seen in this past, I want to say 13 years, those who are in this industry are not here to kind of get rich. They're here because we value the concept of global citizens, intercultural competencies, international experience, but above all, I want to say because we love traveling, we truly do. And so when 2 years ago, I attended a session about the impact of traveling on the environment, at the beginning I was really skeptical and in denial. And I thought, well, if it's so evident, why haven't I thought about it before? I used to be on the road a lot, and kind of like summing up all the days on the road, it was about 4 months a year, and I've never thought about it. And honestly, I've never considered myself insensitive to important social causes. So skeptical at the beginning, but that idea kept bugging me until I decided actually to reach out to one of the presenters. And I said, look, I know it's completely random and you might think I'm crazy, but I need to talk to you about this. And then we talked, and this person is actually a CANIE member, Dr. Stephen Robinson. He's a professor, and kind of with patience shared with me data, resources, and facts. And I kind of let his lesson sink. and then went back and told him I need to tell everyone about what I've just discovered. So that is the main reason why I'm so passionate about CANIE and about sustainable traveling, because I think I really want to make up for not connecting the dots earlier and shouting out loud to every colleague and friend in the field that we're kind of all blind if we don't see this, and we cannot ignore this anymore and any longer, especially because as educators, we have a huge responsibility.
Sure. And I'm so impressed that you have not one, but two jobs, because you dedicate so much time to Travel with CANIE in general, and especially to this Travel with CANIE project. I mean, I feel like you are always every single day checking in with me, seeing how things are going, trying to move things forward. So you've been putting so much passion and energy into this project. And it's great to have you here to talk to everyone about it, because I think that you at this point probably know it best. So leading into, tell us a little bit about what Travel with CANIE is and where did the idea come from?
Okay, so what is Travel with CANIE? So the website definition is that a project that aims at reducing emissions associated with conference travel in our sector while raising awareness around the intersection between climate action and international education. So basically, we try to convince people to opt for a low carbon option when it comes to traveling. And long term, we also hope to convince people to be more selective when it comes to their international business trips. So for the upcoming semester, we have selected two conferences happening in Europe, EAIE in Barcelona and the Forum in Education Abroad in Milan. We set a goal of 20 tons of CO2 emissions saving, and we hope that if we don't reach the goal, at least we create a lot of noise around what we're doing. So we've been talking with both conference organizers to see whether they can actually give visibility to the project and get engaged and involved with us. And the Forum Education Abroad is actually giving a grant of $100 on future conference registration to those traveling sustainably to Milan. So I really feel it's a great start. There's certainly more work to do, but we'll reach out to more conference organizers in the upcoming months to make the project wider and more global. And well, the idea was born out of a random group conversation within the Europe chapter. As you know, CANIE is divided into chapters. So at the end of last year, one of our members, Noreen Lucy, said she had submitted a proposal for EAIE in Helsinki, and she was going to travel by train there. And I thought the idea was completely crazy, and I loved it. And so I felt it was important to make it scalable and to make it a collective project. And so I started kind of bringing this idea up at every single meeting and reaching out via email every single member, kind of a sort of epistolary harassment. And I got people interested, and we finally created a working group. And here we are.
And here we are. And you mentioned one of the goals, which is very tangible and very measurable. It's to essentially calculate by the voluntary offering of this information by people who decide to travel by ground transport, how much carbon emissions in metric tons are being saved. And that's 20 metric tons per conference, which is a large amount. I mean, so far we're at about 25% for EAIE specifically, and that's already taken about 20 people. So it's going to require a lot of commitment from a lot of different people. But what are some of the other goals of the project apart from hitting that number?
I think the main goal is raising awareness, and with awareness, hopefully will come behavioral change, which is something very easy to say, but very hard to achieve. So I think that is the real goal, because 20 tons is like a good amount of like CO2 savings, but it won't change completely the situation. But if each of us kind of understands where we're coming from and why we're doing this, and kind of like adopt another way of traveling or considering traveling to conferences or business traveling in general, that is the goal.
And I think that's part of the answer for the next question, which is what are some of the benefits of having professionals travel by ground transport to these conferences, is that behavioral change and awareness, but are there any other benefits that you see from specifically having the practitioners kind of practice what we are hopefully preaching?
Yeah, actually, we hope that people will meet up on trains or buses to kind of create a convoy. The concept of convoy is something we really like. I mean, hopefully people will be able to get together and start networking on trains or buses or, whichever public transportation you want to take that is not flying. So to make, that time useful and productive as well. And in order to do that, we actually created a LinkedIn group so that people can share their itineraries and hopefully find a travel companion. So that would be another big benefit. And plus another benefit that I see, and it would kind of be one of the things I actually look forward when it comes to like my personal trip to Barcelona, is that the stopover in one of the cities. So I'll do Florence, Milan, Lyon, Lyon, Barcelona. And Lyon is a city that I've never visited before. And so I have 3 hours there, and I've already started planning what I want to do during those 3 hours. And I'm really excited about it, because if I were to fly and I have a stopover somewhere, I'll never be able to leave the airport. So that is, what makes me really excited.
Yeah, certainly. I think that if you have a longer journey, which usually going by train or bus it's going to make it a little bit longer, then even in each direction, you can kind of stop in somewhere different. And maybe it's new to you, or maybe it's somewhere old that you want to spend more time in. So I think that's great. I've never been to Lyon either, so you'll have to tell me what you do, what your itinerary there is. But Margarita, thank you so much for your time today and your very, very busy schedule. Margarita's also got 2 kids, so I really don't know how she does it all. She's Wonder Woman over there, but it's been great to have you talk a little bit more about this project that I know that you have put just so much love and effort into. So really, thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelly, for having me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this project that I really love.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the CANIE Climate Dialogues. If you want to get involved with Travel with CANIE, check out the LinkedIn group, Travel with CANIE, all capital letters, where people traveling sustainably are sharing their itineraries and connecting with colleagues also making the choice to lower their travel emissions. You can find a link to the group in the show notes. Remember to register for CANIE's Climate Action Week, which will begin on November 28th, 2022. There will be sessions on Travel with CANIE where you can meet some of the people involved with the initiative and learn more about what it means to travel with CANIE. 2 quick, easy climate actions you can take today are to subscribe to and rate our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Feel free to leave a comment and let us know what you think. We'd also like to remind our listeners that CANIE is a volunteer-run and led organization. If you have felt inspired by this episode today, please consider heading to our website, canie.org, and making a donation to help our operations and growth.